The rain tapped rhythmically against the windowpane as Daniel sat alone in his dimly lit study. He stared at the framed photo on his desk, his wedding day. He and his wife, Julia, were smiling radiantly, her hand resting on his chest as though staking her claim on him. It was a perfect moment frozen in time, but as Daniel looked at it now, he felt hollow. He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. He couldn't pinpoint when his feelings had shifted. Maybe it was the routine of their lives. Or maybe it was the way Julia had grown distant, her laughter now reserved for phone calls with her friends instead of their once animated conversations. Whatever it was, the man who had once been utterly enchanted by her now felt more like a roommate than a husband. A knock on the door jolted him from his thoughts. "Dinner's ready," Julia called from the hallway. Her voice was clipped, businesslike. "I'll be there in a minute," Daniel replied, his tone matching hers. He stared at the photo one last time before heading downstairs. The meal was quiet, as it often was these days. Their teenage daughter, Emma, chatted animatedly about a school project, oblivious to the tension simmering between her parents. Daniel and Julia exchanged polite nods and murmurs, avoiding each other's eyes. Later that evening, Daniel found himself scrolling through his phone. An email caught his attention. High school reunion. Class of 2003. A wistful smile tugged at his lips. He hadn't thought about those days in years, but as he skimmed the details, memories flooded back, especially of her. Caroline. The girl who had occupied his thoughts through most of high school, the one he had been too shy to confess his feelings to. She had been beautiful, intelligent, and kind, the perfect blend of charm and poise. Daniel had often wondered what had become of her after graduation. Without overthinking, he clicked the RSVP button. 2 weeks later, Daniel arrived at the reunion venue. The room buzzed with laughter and nostalgia as old classmates mingled. He exchanged handshakes and polite small talk, but his mind was elsewhere, scanning the room for one face. "Daniel?" He turned abruptly, and there she was, Caroline. Her golden hair framed her face in soft waves, and though time had added a few lines around her eyes, she was still radiant. For the first time in years, Daniel felt his heart skip a beat. "Caroline," he said, smiling. "It's been forever." Her laugh was warm and familiar. "It really has. How are you?" For the next hour, they talked like old friends. She told him about her career, her travels, and her divorce, which she brushed off with a wry smile. Daniel shared stories of his family, though he skirted around the cracks in his marriage. As the evening wore on, their conversation deepened, their laughter more frequent. When the event ended, either seemed ready to say goodbye. "Let's take a walk," Caroline suggested. They strolled through the quiet streets, reminiscing about their youth. Somewhere along the way, nostalgia gave way to something more electric. When they reached her car, she paused, her gaze locking with his. "Daniel," she began, but the rest of her sentence was lost as he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. The next morning, guilt hit Daniel like a freight train. He sat in his car outside his home, gripping the steering wheel, replaying the night's events. He had crossed a line, one he couldn't uncross. But as shameful as it was, he couldn't deny the spark he had felt with Caroline, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. When he stepped inside, Julia was in the kitchen, sipping coffee. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "You're back early," she said, her tone neutral. "Yeah," he replied, avoiding her gaze. "It was fine, just a lot of catching up." Julia nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. Daniel sensed something in her demeanor, a guardedness he couldn't quite place. But before he could dwell on it, Emma entered the room, and the moment passed. Over the next month, Daniel buried himself in work, hoping to suppress the guilt. He told himself it was a one-time mistake, a fleeting lapse in judgment. Yet thoughts of Caroline lingered in the corners of his mind. Then, one evening, everything unraveled. Julia was unusually quiet at dinner, her fork idly pushing food around her plate. After Emma excused herself, Julia finally spoke. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice steady but strained. "And I need you to hear me out before you say anything." Daniel froze, a chill creeping down his spine. He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "I've been seeing someone," she admitted, her eyes locked on his. "And it's your best friend, Mark." The words hit him like a blow to the chest. His best friend? His mind raced, trying to comprehend what she was saying, but her next words cut through his thoughts like a knife. "I didn't plan for this to happen, but it did. And I think we need to talk about where we go from here." Daniel stared at her, his world crashing around him. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His chest heaved with a mixture of betrayal, anger, and something else. Because deep down, he knew, he was no saint in this mess. Daniel stared at Julia in stunned silence, her confession replaying in his mind like a broken record. Mark? The friend who had been by his side since childhood? The man who had been there for every significant moment of his life? The betrayal twisted in his gut, but there was something deeper, an unwelcome recognition of his own culpability. Julia's gaze didn't waver. Her expression wasn't smug or defensive, it was almost resigned. She seemed prepared for his anger, braced for whatever explosion might come next. "How long?" he finally asked, his voice hollow. Julia hesitated, and in that pause, he could feel his patience fraying. "How long?" he repeated, sharper this time. "A few months," she admitted softly, folding her hands in her lap. It started when you began pulling away. I didn't know how to reach you, and Mark he was there." Daniel rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He couldn't stay seated. His body was vibrating with restless energy, with anger that had nowhere to go. He paced to the window, staring out into the night. "You think this is my fault?" he asked, his voice tight. "That because I've been distant, it's okay to, what? Sleep with my best friend?" "That's not what I said," Julia countered, her voice steady. "But we've both been pretending everything is fine when it isn't. We haven't been happy for years, Daniel. You know that." He turned to face her, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "So what? You just gave up on us? Decided to blow up our marriage?" Her eyes flashed with something he hadn't seen in a long time, anger. "Don't act like you're blameless in this. You've been checked out for years, Daniel. You barely even look at me anymore. And if we're being honest, I'm not the only one who's been unfaithful, am I?" The words hit him like a slap. His breath caught, and for a moment, all he could do was stare at her, stunned. She knew. Somehow she knew. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, though the denial felt weak even as the words left his mouth. Julia's laugh was bitter. "Don't insult my intelligence. I'm not stupid. You were practically glowing after your reunion. I didn't need to see the lipstick on your shirt to know you were with someone else." Daniel sank into the couch, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He hadn't thought she would find out, not because he was careful, but because he assumed she wasn't paying attention. The realization stung more than he expected. She had been paying attention, even when he hadn't. "Fine," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "Yes, I made a mistake. But it wasn't some long-term affair like what you're describing. It was one night. One stupid, regrettable night." Julia folded her arms, her expression unreadable. "Does it matter how long it was? You still broke our vows, Daniel. Just like I did." The room fell into silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. For the first time in years, they were being honest with each other, and the truth was ugly. Later that night, Daniel lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Julia was asleep beside him, her breathing slow and steady. He wanted to hate her, to bury himself in anger, but the more he thought about it, the harder it became to place all the blame on her. She was right, they had been unhappy for a long time. He just hadn't wanted to admit it. His thoughts drifted to Emma. How would this affect her? She was 16, old enough to sense that something was wrong. The idea of breaking up their family made his chest ache, But how could they move forward after everything that had happened? An idea began to form in his mind, one he wasn't sure he even believed in. It was unconventional, maybe even foolish, but it was the only way he could see to keep their family together. He didn't want a divorce, not for himself, not for Emma. He waited until morning to broach the subject. An open relationship? Julia's brow furrowed as she sat across from him at the kitchen table, her coffee untouched. It's not ideal, Daniel admitted. But neither is splitting up. Look, I know things between us aren't the same as they used to be. I don't know if we can ever get back to what we had, but maybe we don't have to. Maybe we can find a way to make this work without pretending to be something we're not. Julia stared at him, her expression a mix of disbelief and intrigue. You're serious about this? Yes, he said firmly. I don't want to lose you, Julia. And I don't want to lose our family. But if we're both looking for something we can't find in each other, maybe this is a way to, I don't know, to coexist. She was quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on the table. When she finally looked up, her eyes were filled with uncertainty. I don't know if I can do this, Daniel. It's not just about us. What if Emma finds out? What if it makes things worse instead of better? It's a risk, he acknowledged. But I'd rather take that risk than throw away everything we've built. We don't have to decide right now. Just think about it. Julia nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. Okay. I'll think about it. As Daniel left the table, he felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Yet, deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. The days that followed were tense and quiet. Daniel gave Julia the space she needed to process his proposal, but every passing moment felt like walking a tightrope. Emma remained blissfully unaware of the emotional landmine buried beneath their family dinners, her laughter and stories cutting through the tension like a bomb they didn't deserve. Daniel threw himself into work, using the distraction to avoid the gnawing questions in his mind. Was he doing the right thing? Was this idea, a relationship without boundaries, a solution or just a delaying tactic? Would Julia even agree to it? One evening, as he sat in the study rereading the same email for the 5th time, Julia walked in. She stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside, her arms crossed over her chest. I've been thinking, she began, her voice even but guarded. About what you said. About an open relationship. Daniel set his laptop aside, his pulse quickening. And? I still don't know if it's the right thing to do, she admitted, sitting on the edge of the couch. But I see why you suggested it. And maybe you're right. Maybe this is the only way we can move forward without destroying everything. A wave of relief washed over him, but it was tempered by the uncertainty in her tone. So you're willing to try? She nodded hesitantly. Yes. But only if we're clear on the rules. I won't agree to this if it's going to turn into chaos. Of course, Daniel said quickly. We can set boundaries, talk about what's okay and what isn't. Julia raised an eyebrow. And how do you see this working, exactly? Do we tell each other everything? Do we keep it secret? What happens if one of us decides they want to stop? He swallowed, realizing he hadn't thought this far ahead. I think honesty is important. We should tell each other, at least the broad strokes. And if either of us wants to stop, we stop. No questions asked? And Emma? Julia pressed. We can't let her find out. This has to stay between us. Agreed, Daniel said firmly. She doesn't need to know. Julia studied him for a moment, then nodded. Okay. Let's try it. But if it gets too messy, if it starts to hurt Emma, or us, we call it off. Deal? Deal, Daniel said, though his voice caught slightly on the word. The next few weeks were a strange dance of caution and newfound freedom. Daniel and Julia maintained their outward roles as husband and wife, but behind closed doors, the cracks in their relationship became more visible, and oddly less suffocating. The knowledge that they were no longer pretending lifted some of the weight, though it also brought its own challenges. For Daniel, The hardest part was navigating his feelings for Caroline. He hadn't contacted her since the reunion, unsure of how to approach her now. The guilt he had felt that night lingered, but the thought of her still sent a thrill through him. Was it too soon to reach out? Would she even want to hear from him? Meanwhile, Julia seemed to throw herself into her own freedom with more ease. She spent more evenings out with friends, her phone lighting up with messages that she now made no effort to hide. Daniel didn't ask questions, though the sight of her smiling at her screen sent an ache through his chest. One evening, as they were tidying up after dinner, Julia broke the silence. "I'm seeing Mark tomorrow," she said, her tone casual. Daniel froze, the plate in his hand slipping slightly. "Mark?" he echoed. "Yes," she said, meeting his eyes. "I thought you'd want to know." His stomach churned, but he forced himself to nod. "Okay. Thanks for telling me." She gave him a small, almost apologetic smile before heading upstairs. Daniel remained in the kitchen, staring blankly at the sink. He had agreed to this, he reminded himself. He had no right to feel betrayed. But knowing it in theory didn't make the reality any easier. The next day, while Julia was out, Daniel found himself staring at his phone, Caroline's number pulled up on the screen. His thumb hovered over the call button, his mind a storm of doubt and anticipation. Finally, he pressed it, the sound of the dial tone making his heart race. "Hello?" Caroline's familiar voice answered. "Caroline," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's Daniel. From the reunion." Her tone brightened immediately. "Daniel! I was wondering when I'd hear from you. How are you?" He hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I'm doing okay. How about you?" "I'm good," she said warmly. "It's really nice to hear from you. I wasn't sure if that night was just, a one-time thing." "No," he said quickly. "I mean, yes it was, but… Look, I'd like to see you again. If you're open to it." There was a pause on the other end, and Daniel held his breath. "Okay," Caroline said finally, her voice soft but certain. "I'd like that too." Relief flooded through him. They agreed to meet for coffee later that week, the thought of seeing her again both thrilling and terrifying. When Friday came, Daniel arrived at the cafe early, his nerves on edge. He sipped his coffee, his eyes darting to the door every time it opened. Finally, Caroline walked in, her smile lighting up the room. "Hi," she said as she slid into the seat across from him. "It's good to see you." "You too," he said, feeling a genuine smile spread across his face for the first time in weeks. They talked for hours, the conversation flowing as easily as it had at the reunion. Caroline was warm, understanding, and easy to be around. For a while, Daniel forgot about the complications of his life and simply enjoyed her company. But as the evening wore on and they prepared to part ways, reality came crashing back. He was still married. He was still walking a dangerous line. And no matter how much he wanted to escape into this new connection, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. When Daniel returned home that night, Julia was waiting for him. Her expression was unreadable as she asked, "How was your evening?" "It was good," Daniel said cautiously. "How was yours?" She hesitated, then gave him a small smile. "It was fine." They stared at each other for a moment, the weight of their choices hanging between them. This fragile truce they had formed was holding, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The fragile arrangement between Daniel and Julia persisted, but it was far from stable. Days turned into weeks, each one a balancing act of unspoken boundaries and growing unease. On the surface, their family life remained intact. Emma had no clue about the storm brewing behind closed doors. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the cracks were widening, threatening to shatter everything. Caroline had become a quiet escape for him. They met regularly, sharing meals and conversation that felt lighter than anything he'd experienced in years. But with every stolen moment, Daniel's guilt grew heavier. He wasn't sure if it was because of Julia or Emma, or the realization that he was lying to himself about what he truly wanted. One Friday evening, Daniel and Julia found themselves alone in the living room. Emma was spending the night at a friend's house, leaving the house unnervingly quiet. Julia sat across from him, flipping through her phone, while Daniel nursed a drink, his eyes fixed on the television, but not registering a single image. "I've been meaning to ask," Julia said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Have you been seeing her?" Daniel's stomach clenched. He didn't need to ask who she meant. "Caroline?" he asked cautiously. Julia nodded, her expression unreadable. "Yes," he admitted after a long pause. "I've been seeing her." Julia set her phone aside, leaning back against the couch. "Do you care about her?" The question caught him off guard. He hesitated, unsure of how to answer without tipping the delicate balance they had managed to maintain. "I don't know," he said honestly. "It's complicated." Julia's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't look surprised. "I've been seeing Mark regularly," she admitted after a moment. "He asked me the same thing about you. If I still cared." "And what did you say?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Julia hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I told him I don't know." The admission hit Daniel harder than he expected. He had prepared himself for anger, for resentment, but hearing her uncertainty stung in a way he hadn't anticipated. "What are we doing, Julia?" he asked finally, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Is this really the life we want? Pretending everything's fine while we drift further and further apart?" She sighed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I don't know, Daniel. I thought this might help, that it might make things easier, but now I'm not so sure. Every time I'm with Mark, I feel like I'm running away from something I don't know how to face." Daniel stared at her, a lump forming in his throat. "And when I'm with Caroline, I feel like I'm trying to recapture something I lost a long time ago. But it's not real. Not completely." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the weight of their shared history pressed down on them. The love they had once felt for each other wasn't gone, but it was buried beneath years of neglect, resentment, and unspoken pain. "What do we do?" Julia asked softly. Daniel shook his head. "I don't know. But I don't think we can keep living like this." The next morning, Daniel woke to find Julia already in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She looked up as he entered, her face drawn and tired. "I think we need to set some ground rules," she said without preamble. "If we're going to keep this arrangement, we need to be clearer about what's okay and what isn't." Daniel nodded, pouring himself a cup of coffee and sitting across from her. "I agree. What do you have in mind?" Julia took a deep breath, as though steeling herself. "First, no one comes to the house. This is our space, and I don't want it tainted by anyone else." "Fair," Daniel said, though he felt a pang of guilt. He had never considered bringing Caroline home, but the thought of Julia and Mark here, in the same space where their family memories lived, made him nauseous. "Second," Julia continued, "if either of us starts developing serious feelings for someone else, we have to talk about it. No secrets." "Agreed," Daniel said. He hesitated, then added, "And no prioritizing anyone else over Emma. She comes first, no matter what." "Of course," Julia said firmly. "Emma always comes first." They fell into silence, the air between them heavy with the weight of their decisions. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best they could manage for now. That evening, Daniel met Caroline for dinner. He couldn't shake the conversation he'd had with Julia from his mind, and it made him see Caroline in a different light. She was still warm and understanding, her laughter like a soothing balm, but Daniel began to wonder if he was clinging to her as a way to avoid dealing with the problems in his marriage. "You're quiet tonight," Caroline said, tilting her head. "Something on your mind?" Daniel hesitated, then decided to be honest. "It's just this whole situation with Julia. It's complicated." Caroline nodded, her expression sympathetic. "I can imagine. Are you two okay?" "I don't know," he admitted. "We've set some rules, tried to make this arrangement work, but it still feels like we're just delaying the inevitable." Caroline reached across the table, placing a hand over his. For what it's worth, I think you're doing the best you can. But maybe you need to figure out what you really want, whether it's her, me, or something else entirely. Her words stayed with him long after the dinner ended, haunting him as he drove home. When Daniel returned, the house was dark except for the light in the study. He found Julia sitting at his desk, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked up when he entered, her eyes shadowed with something he couldn't quite place. "Mark called," she said, her voice quiet. "He thinks I should leave you." Daniel's heart sank. "And what do you think?" Julia swirled the wine in her glass, staring at the crimson liquid as though it held the answer. "I don't know," she said finally. "But I think we're running out of time to figure it out." Her words hung in the air, a chilling reminder of how precarious their situation had become. Daniel felt the weight of their shared history pressing down on him, but he also felt the pull of something he couldn't yet name, a desire to fix what was broken, even if it seemed impossible. For the first time in years, he realized how much he stood to lose. The days following Julia's chilling declaration were fraught with tension. Every conversation felt like stepping onto a minefield, every glance a test of endurance. For the first time, Daniel truly understood the precariousness of their situation. His family was hanging by a thread, and the balance they had tried so desperately to maintain was beginning to tip. One afternoon, Daniel found himself alone in the house. Julia had taken Emma to a weekend soccer tournament, and the silence felt oppressive. He sat in the living room, his thoughts racing. The memories of their early days together, the laughter, the shared dreams, were a stark contrast to the cold reality they now faced. On impulse, he picked up his phone and dialed Caroline. The line rang twice before she answered. "Daniel," she said warmly. "This is a surprise." "Hi," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Are you free to talk?" "Of course." "Is everything okay?" He hesitated, then sighed. "No, not really. Julia and things are getting worse." Caroline's tone softened. "Do you want to talk about it?" For the next hour, Daniel poured his heart out, telling her everything: Julia's comment about Mark, their attempts to navigate the open relationship, and his fear of losing his family. Caroline listened patiently, her quiet understanding a balm to his frayed nerves. When he finished, she said gently, "Daniel, it sounds like you're at a crossroads. You can't keep one foot in each world forever. At some point, you'll have to decide where you stand." Her words lingered in his mind long after they hung up. The next morning, Julia and Emma returned home. Emma was buzzing with excitement about the tournament, oblivious to the tension between her parents. Daniel listened to her stories with a forced smile, but his mind was elsewhere. Later that evening, while Emma was upstairs, Julia confronted him in the kitchen. "You seemed distracted earlier," she said, crossing her arms. "Something on your mind?" Daniel hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I've been thinking about what you said. About us running out of time." Julia's expression softened, and for a moment, the tension between them seemed to lift. "And I think you're right," he admitted. "We've been putting off the hard conversations for too long. Maybe it's time we figure out what we really want." She nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I've been thinking about that too." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Julia broke it. "I think we should take some time apart." The air seemed to leave the room. Daniel stared at her, his chest tightening. "You want to separate?" "Not permanently," she said quickly. "At least, not yet. But I think we need space to figure out what we want, individually. Because right now, I don't think either of us can see clearly." The idea of separation terrified him, but deep down, he couldn't deny the logic in her suggestion. They had been circling the same problems for months, and perhaps distance would give them the clarity they desperately needed. "All right," he said finally, his voice thick. "If that's what you think is best." The following week was a whirlwind of logistical planning. Julia decided to move in with her sister for a while, taking Emma with her. The arrangement was meant to be temporary, But Daniel couldn't shake the fear that it was the first step towards something more permanent. On the day of their departure, the house felt unbearably empty. Emma hugged him tightly, her brow furrowed with confusion. "Why can't you come with us, Dad?" Daniel forced a smile, ruffling her hair. "Your mom and I just need some time to work on a few things. But I'll see you all the time, I promise." Julia's expression was unreadable as she stood by the door. "We'll talk soon," she said softly before leading Emma out. When the door closed, the silence was deafening. In the days that followed, Daniel tried to throw himself into work, but the emptiness of the house was a constant reminder of what he had lost. He spent his evenings pacing the rooms, his thoughts a relentless cycle of regret and self-recrimination. Caroline checked in on him frequently, her texts and phone calls offering a lifeline. She was kind and supportive, but as much as Daniel appreciated her presence, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Being with her was easy, but it wasn't enough. One evening, Julia called. Her voice was calm but distant, as though she had already begun to detach herself from their shared life. "How are you?" she asked. "Lonely," he admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop it. She didn't respond immediately, and the silence on the other end of the line was almost unbearable. Finally she said, "Emma misses you. She keeps asking when you're coming to visit." "I miss her too," Daniel said, his throat tightening. How are you holding up?" Julia hesitated, then said, "It's strange. Being away from the house, from you, it's giving me a lot of time to think. About what went wrong. About what I want." Daniel's chest ached. "And what do you want?" "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But I think I'm starting to figure it out." The line went quiet again, and when she finally said goodbye, Daniel felt more lost than ever. That night, Daniel sat alone in the study, staring at the wedding photo on his desk. The smiles frozen in time felt like a mockery of everything they had become. He thought about Julia's words, about Caroline's advice, and about the life he was trying so desperately to salvage. For the first time, he wondered if it was already too late. The house felt like a tomb in Julia and Emma's absence. Days blurred together for Daniel, filled with half-hearted attempts at work and long nights of staring at the ceiling. The silence was maddening, but it forced him to confront the questions he had avoided for so long. What did he truly want? And, more importantly, what was he willing to fight for? One evening, while Daniel sat nursing a drink, his phone buzzed. It was Caroline. He hesitated before answering. "Hi, Caroline," he said, his voice weary. "Hi," she replied, her tone cautious. "You don't sound great. Is everything okay?" Daniel exhaled deeply, rubbing his temples. "Not really. Julia and I are separated for now." Caroline's voice softened. "I'm sorry to hear that. How are you holding up?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I thought having space might help, but it's just making everything feel more final." There was a pause on the other end, then Caroline said, "Daniel, can I be honest with you?" "Of course. I care about you," she began, her words careful. "But I don't think I'm what you need right now. I think you're still holding on to your marriage, even if you don't realize it." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. "Caroline, that's not—" "Let me finish," she interrupted gently. "You're a good man, Daniel. But you're not really here with me. And I don't want to be the reason you don't figure out what you truly want. So maybe we should take a step back." The silence that followed was deafening. He had leaned on Caroline for support, and now she was stepping away, leaving him to face the truth alone. "Okay," he said finally, his voice breaking. "I understand. I hope you find your answers," she said softly before ending the call. The next day, Daniel woke with a strange sense of clarity. Caroline's words had forced him to confront a reality he had been avoiding. He wasn't ready to let go of Julia. Despite everything, her affair with Mark, their years of distance, he still loved her. And if there was any chance of salvaging their marriage, he had to try. That evening, Daniel called Julia. His heart pounded as the phone rang, each second stretching endlessly. Finally, she answered. Daniel, she said, her tone guarded. What's going on? I need to see you, he said, his voice firm. Can we meet? Just the two of us? Julia hesitated. I don't know if that's a good idea. Please, he pressed. I need to talk to you. In person. After a long pause, she sighed. Okay. Tomorrow. Coffee shop on Main Street, 2 p.m. Thank you, he said, relief flooding through him. The next day, Daniel arrived early, his nerves frayed. He sat by the window, nursing a coffee that had long gone cold. When Julia walked in, he felt a pang in his chest. She looked beautiful, but there was a tiredness in her eyes that mirrored his own. She slid into the seat across from him, folding her hands on the table. So, what did you want to talk about? Daniel took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. I know things have been terrible between us, he began. And I know I've made mistakes, huge ones. But I can't keep pretending I don't care about you. About us. I still love you, Julia. And I want to find a way to make this work. Julia's expression softened, but her eyes remained cautious. Daniel, I don't know if we can go back to what we had. I'm not asking to go back, he said quickly. I know we've both changed. But maybe we can build something new. Something better. She looked away, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. What about Caroline? I ended it, he said firmly. Because I realized she wasn't what I wanted. You are. Julia's gaze snapped back to his, and for the first time in weeks, he saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. You really mean that? Yes, he said. But I know it's not that simple. We both have work to do. We've both hurt each other, and it's going to take time to heal. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Are you? Julia was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally she said, I don't know if I can trust you again, Daniel. And I don't know if I can trust myself, either. Then let's figure it out together, he said, his voice steady. We don't have to have all the answers right now. But if we're both willing to try, that's a start. She studied him, her eyes searching his face for something. Whatever she saw seemed to reassure her, because she nodded slowly. Okay, she said. Let's try. That night, Daniel returned home with a sense of cautious optimism. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, he knew that, but for the first time in months, he felt like there was a glimmer of hope. When he crawled into bed, the silence no longer felt suffocating. Instead, it felt like a promise, a blank slate waiting to be filled. The agreement to try again felt like a fragile truce, delicate and vulnerable to collapse. Daniel and Julia both knew that words were easy, but actions would define their path forward. For the first time in years, they began to truly talk, not the surface-level exchanges of two people sharing a house but the raw, difficult conversations they had been avoiding for years. 2 days after their meeting, Julia came by the house to drop Emma off. Daniel greeted her at the door, his heart pounding in his chest. Emma darted past them, eager to retrieve something from her room, leaving the two of them alone on the porch. Do you want to come in? Daniel asked hesitantly. Julia hesitated, then nodded. Sure. Just for a minute. They stepped inside, and the house seemed to shrink around them, the familiar walls heavy with memories. Daniel led her to the living room, where they sat across from each other, the silence stretching. I've been thinking about everything. Julia began, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. And I think if we're going to do this, really try to fix things, we need to be honest about what went wrong. Daniel nodded, bracing himself. I agree. Julia took a deep breath. I felt invisible, Daniel. For years. You were so focused on work, on providing for us, that I started to feel like I didn't matter anymore. And when Mark showed me attention, I was weak. I made a terrible mistake. Her voice wavered, and she looked away, tears glistening in her eyes. I hate what I did to you, to us. But I need you to know that it wasn't about not loving you. It was about feeling lost. Daniel's chest tightened. Hearing her say the words aloud hurt, but it also gave him clarity. I think I knew, he admitted. Maybe not consciously, but deep down, I felt you pulling away. And instead of facing it, I pulled away too. I convinced myself that focusing on work was the best way to help our family, but all it did was drive us further apart. He hesitated, then added, and I wasn't faithful either. What I did with Caroline, it wasn't just a mistake. It was selfish. I was looking for something I'd lost with you, and I hurt you in the process. I'm sorry, Julia. Truly. She met his gaze, her expression a mixture of pain and understanding. I don't know how we're going to move past all of this, she said softly, but I want to try. For Emma. For us. Daniel nodded, his resolve strengthening. Me too. And I think we should see a counselor. Someone who can help us navigate all of this. Julia's eyes widened slightly, and she gave a small, hopeful smile. That's a good idea. Maybe that's exactly what we need. The next week, they attended their first counseling session together. Sitting in the therapist's office was uncomfortable at first, the weight of their confessions filling the room. But as they spoke, sometimes angrily, sometimes tearfully, they began to uncover the roots of their issues. The therapist, a kind but firm woman named Dr. Ellis, guided them through the tangled web of their emotions. She encouraged them to focus not just on the past but on the future they wanted to build. It's going to take time, Dr. Ellis said during their second session. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight. But if you're both committed to this process, there's hope. At home, the changes were small but significant. Daniel started leaving work earlier, making an effort to be present for family dinners. Julia, in turn, opened up more about her feelings, sharing parts of herself that she had kept hidden for years. They weren't magically healed, but they were taking steps in the right direction. Emma noticed the difference too. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, she looked between her parents with a curious expression. You guys are different lately, she said, her tone laced with suspicion. Like you're actually talking. Daniel and Julia exchanged a glance, a faint smile passing between them. We're just working on things, Julia said gently. Trying to be better. Emma raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Instead, she smiled. Well, whatever you're doing, it's working. It's nice not to feel like the referee all the time. Her words were light, but they struck Daniel deeply. He hadn't realized how much Emma had picked up on over the years. The weight of their mistakes loomed large, but her small smile gave him hope that they were on the right track. Despite their progress, there were still difficult moments. Julia's relationship with Mark was a shadow that lingered over them, and Daniel's history with Caroline was a wound that hadn't fully healed. Jealousy and doubt crept in at times, threatening to undo their progress. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Julia hesitated before speaking. Mark texted me today, she said, her voice quiet. Daniel stiffened, his grip tightening on the armrest. What did he want? He wanted to know if I'm still planning to leave you, she said, her gaze fixed on the floor. I told him no. That we're trying to work things out. Relief flooded through Daniel, but it was tempered by anger. And what did he say to that? He wasn't happy, Julia admitted. But that's not my problem anymore. I told him I can't see him again. Daniel's shoulders relaxed slightly, though the anger still simmered beneath the surface. Thank you, he said, for being honest with me. Julia nodded, her expression resolute. I want this to work, Daniel. I don't want anything, or anyone, to get in the way. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a spark of hope ignite. Their path was still uncertain, but they were walking it together, one step at a time. The decision to move forward together was a turning point for Daniel and Julia, but it was far from the end of their struggles. The trust between them was fragile, like a cracked vase that had been carefully glued back together. Every word, every action, had the potential to either strengthen their bond or shatter it completely. One evening, as they sat together in the living room after Emma had gone to bed, Daniel took a deep breath. He had been dreading this conversation, but he knew it was necessary. Julia, he began, his voice steady. I want to talk about Mark. She froze, her hand pausing mid-reach for her glass of water. What about him? I need to understand why, Daniel said, his tone gentle but firm. Why him? Out of all the people, why my best friend? Julia's face flushed with shame, and she set the glass down with a trembling hand. I've asked myself the same question 100 times, she admitted. It wasn't planned, Daniel. I didn't wake up one day and decide to betray you like that. Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. It started small, just conversations. He would ask how I was doing, really ask, in a way that felt genuine. And I was lonely. I didn't even realize how much until someone noticed me again. Daniel's chest ached at her words, but he forced himself to stay calm. Did it mean anything? To you, I mean. She shook her head emphatically. No. Not really. It felt good in the moment, but it wasn't real. It was a distraction, an escape from everything I didn't want to face. And now? Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Do you still have feelings for him? No, Julia said firmly. Whatever I thought I felt for him was built on lies. It was never about him. It was about me trying to fill a void. And I hate that I let it get that far. I hate what I did to you. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing her words. Thank you for telling me, he said after a long pause. I needed to hear that. Julia reached across the coffee table, her hand hovering over his. Do you think we'll ever move past this? Daniel hesitated, then placed his hand over hers. I think we can. But it's going to take time and effort. From both of us. In the weeks that followed, they focused on rebuilding their relationship brick by brick. Counseling sessions became a safe space where they could confront their fears and insecurities without judgment. They learned to communicate in ways they never had before, sharing not just their frustrations but also their hopes and dreams for the future. Julia began to let her guard down, showing Daniel sides of herself he hadn't seen in years. She talked about her fears of growing older, her struggles with feeling like she had lost her identity, and her guilt over how those feelings had pushed her into Mark's arms. Daniel, in turn, admitted how his single-minded focus on work had blinded him to the cracks forming in their marriage. He confessed how he had felt inadequate, as though he couldn't provide Julia with the emotional connection she needed. These conversations were painful, but they were also cathartic. For the first time in years, they were truly seeing each other. Despite their progress, the specter of Mark continued to loom over them. One day, as Daniel was leaving work, his phone buzzed with a text. It was from Mark. Can we talk? Just once? I think we need to clear the air. Daniel stared at the message, his jaw tightening. The thought of seeing Mark again filled him with a mixture of anger and dread, but he also knew that ignoring the situation wouldn't make it go away. That evening, he showed the message to Julia. Her face paled as she read it, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice shaking. I don't know, Daniel admitted. But I think I need to hear what he has to say. Julia's lips pressed into a thin line. If you decide to meet him, be careful. He's good at manipulating people. Daniel nodded, her words echoing in his mind as he composed a response. A few days later, Daniel met Mark at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. It was a neutral place, far from the memories of their shared past. When Mark walked in, Daniel felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. His former best friend looked the same, confident, composed, but there was a tension in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Thanks for meeting me, Mark said, sitting across from him. I'm not sure why I'm here, Daniel replied coldly. But you wanted to talk, so talk. Mark sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I owe you an apology. What I did was wrong, unforgivable, really. And I hate that I hurt you. I hate that I destroyed our friendship. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. I won't make excuses, Mark continued. I was selfish, and I crossed a line I never should have. I've lost a lot because of what I did, and I know I deserve that. But I also know I can never make it right. Daniel stared at him for a long moment, his emotions warring inside him. Part of him wanted to lash out, to make Mark feel the pain he had caused. But another part of him, the part that had spent months in therapy, working to move forward, recognized that anger wouldn't change the past. "I appreciate the apology," Daniel said finally. "But I don't think we can go back to being friends. Too much has happened." Mark nodded, his shoulders sagging. "I understand. And for what it's worth, I hope you and Julia can make it work. She's a good person." Daniel stood, his heart heavy. "She is. And so am I. That's why I'm not letting this destroy us." As he walked out of the cafe, Daniel felt a strange sense of closure. Mark was no longer a shadow in his life, a painful reminder of betrayal, but a chapter he was ready to close. That night, when Daniel told Julia about the meeting, her face softened with relief. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Lighter," he admitted. "Like I've finally put it behind me." Julia reached for his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "I'm glad. I think we're both finally starting to heal." Daniel squeezed her hand, a sense of peace washing over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like they were moving forward, not as individuals clinging to the remnants of their marriage, but as partners rebuilding something stronger. In the months that followed, Daniel and Julia slowly but steadily found their footing. Their progress wasn't linear. There were moments of doubt, flashes of old wounds reopening, but they were learning to navigate them together. The weight of their mistakes no longer felt like an anchor but rather a reminder of how far they had come. Emma, perceptive as ever, began to notice the changes in her parents. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, she asked, "Are you guys better now? Like for real?" Daniel and Julia exchanged a glance, sharing a small smile before Julia replied, "We're working on it. Relationships take a lot of effort, and sometimes you have to face hard things to make them stronger." Emma frowned, considering this. "So, it's not like in movies where people just magically fix everything and live happily ever after?" Daniel chuckled. "Not quite. Real life's a bit messier than that. But it's worth it," Julia added, reaching across the table to squeeze Emma's hand. "Especially when it's about the people you love." Emma smiled, her shoulders relaxing. "I'm glad. I like seeing you guys happy." Her words brought a lump to Daniel's throat. He reached for his glass of water, hoping to hide the emotion welling up inside him. For the first time in years he felt like they were giving Emma the stability she deserved. Their therapy sessions continued, shifting focus from the pain of the past to the possibilities of the future. Dr. Ellis encouraged them to set new goals, both as individuals and as a couple. "What's something you've always wanted to do together but never made time for?" she asked during one session. Daniel and Julia exchanged a look. The question seemed deceptively simple, but it sparked a deeper conversation. "We used to love traveling," Julia said. "Before Emma was born, we would take these spontaneous weekend trips. I miss that." Daniel nodded, his mind drifting back to those carefree days. "Me too. Maybe we could start small, plan a trip, just the two of us." Julia smiled, a hint of excitement in her eyes. "I'd like that." Their first trip was a weekend getaway to a quiet lakeside cabin. It was far from glamorous, but it gave them the space to reconnect without the distractions of everyday life. They spent their days hiking, cooking meals together, and talking late into the night about everything from their hopes for Emma to the small dreams they had let slip over the years. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Julia turned to Daniel. "Do you think we'll ever stop feeling like we have to prove ourselves to each other?" Daniel considered her question, staring into the flickering flames. "Maybe not completely," he admitted. "But maybe that's not a bad thing. If we keep trying to be better, for ourselves and for each other, that's what matters, right?" Julia smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I think you're right. And I think I'm finally starting to believe in us again." Her words warmed him in a way he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future with her that wasn't marred by regret but filled with possibility. When they returned home, they carried the peace of that trip with them. Their efforts to rebuild weren't just about repairing the past but also about creating something new. They planned family outings with Emma, rediscovered shared hobbies, and made a point of spending time together without distractions. Julia started taking an art class, something she had always wanted to do but had put off for years. Daniel began volunteering at a local mentorship program, finding fulfillment in helping others. These individual pursuits gave them a sense of balance, making their time together even more meaningful. One evening, as they sat on the back porch watching the sunset, Daniel reached for Julia's hand. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "What's that?" she asked, tilting her head. "Our vows," he said, his voice thoughtful. "When we got married, we promised to love each other through everything, good and bad. And I don't think we really understood what that meant back then." Julia smiled softly. "I don't think anyone does when they're standing at the altar. It's something you learn as you go." "Then maybe we should renew them," Daniel said, his heart pounding. "Not because we have to, but because we want to. To start fresh." Julia's eyes widened, her expression shifting from surprise to something deeper. "You'd really want to do that?" "More than anything," Daniel said. "We've been through so much, and we're still here. I think that deserves to be celebrated." Tears glistened in Julia's eyes as she nodded. "I'd love that." The idea of a vow renewal brought a sense of excitement and purpose to their lives. They decided to keep it small, inviting only close friends and family. Emma was thrilled to help plan, taking charge of decorations and insisting on writing a speech. On a crisp autumn afternoon, they stood in their backyard, surrounded by golden leaves and their loved ones. As Daniel and Julia exchanged their new vows, their voices steady and filled with emotion, it felt like they were finally stepping into the future they had fought so hard to build. That night, after the guests had left and Emma was asleep, Daniel and Julia sat together under the stars. The quiet was comfortable, the kind of silence that spoke of understanding and peace. "I'm proud of us," Julia said, her voice soft. "Me too," Daniel replied, wrapping an arm around her. "We've come a long way." As they sat there, the weight of their past no longer felt like a burden but a testament to their resilience. They had faced the storm, and though they were forever changed, they had emerged stronger, together. Months passed, and the vow renewal became a turning point for Daniel and Julia. It wasn't a magic solution to their problems, but it cemented their commitment to one another and gave them a solid foundation to rebuild on. Each day, they worked to strengthen their bond, learning to appreciate the small moments that had once gone unnoticed. One sunny Saturday morning, Daniel and Julia were in the kitchen preparing breakfast when Emma bounded downstairs. She looked at her parents with a mix of amusement and suspicion. "You two are really weird now," she said, grabbing a piece of toast. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Weird how?" Emma smirked. "Like happy. It's kind of gross, honestly." Julia laughed, rolling her eyes. "Thanks for the vote of confidence, kid." "No, seriously," Emma said, her tone softening. "I like it. It feels nice. Like we're a family again." Daniel and Julia exchanged a glance, a warmth spreading between them. Emma's words were simple, but they carried a weight of validation they hadn't realized they needed. "Well, don't get used to it," Daniel teased. "We reserve the right to embarrass you at any moment." Emma grinned, throwing a napkin at him before darting out of the room. The holidays that year were the best they had experienced in years. The house was filled with laughter, the lingering shadows of the past finally beginning to fade. Daniel and Julia took time to appreciate their life together, no longer taking the small joys for granted. On New Year's Eve, they sat by the fire after Emma had gone to bed. A bottle of champagne sat between them, the glasses half empty as they reflected on the year gone by. "We've been through a lot," Julia said, her voice thoughtful. "But I think this is the first time I've felt truly hopeful about the future." Daniel reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Me too. And I think the hard times made us stronger." Julia smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "So, what's next for us?" Daniel hesitated, then said, "I think it's about figuring out what makes us happy, together and individually. But whatever it is, I know we'll handle it. We've proven that. Julia looked up at him, her eyes shining. We really have, haven't we? As the months turned into years, their marriage evolved into something new, something better. They didn't shy away from the hard conversations anymore, and they made a conscious effort to keep their relationship a priority. Date nights became a regular occurrence, even if it was just a walk in the park or a quiet evening at home. Emma, too, thrived in the renewed stability of her family. She often joked that her parents were annoyingly in sync, but her beaming smile told a different story. One evening, years later, Daniel and Julia found themselves sitting on the same back porch where they had made their promise to start anew. The stars above were the same, but the couple beneath them had transformed. Do you ever think about where we were back then? Julia asked, her voice soft. All the time, Daniel admitted. It feels like a lifetime ago. But I think those struggles made us who we are today. Julia nodded, a contented smile on her face. I wouldn't change any of it. Even the hardest parts. They brought us here. Daniel reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. And here is exactly where I want to be. As they sat together, the cool night air wrapping around them, the future stretched out before them like a blank canvas. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and they would continue painting it, one stroke at a time, together. For the first time in a long time, they weren't looking back. They were looking forward. If you want more stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.